It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew. Andrew Hain owns Elmore Mountain Bread with his wife, Blair Marvin, in northern Vermont. They bake wood-fired breads using stone-ground local grain. Andrew designed and built his own mill for their bakery, and a few years later started New American Stone Mills to provide bakers with natural granite stone mills. He has set up over 100 mills around the world for bakers, millers, and farmers. So with that, Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. Sorry, I had a little technical glitch there. My internet dropped out just as I was about to get going here. But
we were a little nervous, but we knew you'd come through for us. So.
Yeah, I have a hotspot going, and hopefully that'll carry us through. So thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Northern Crops Institute for your interest in what we do and having me come to speak with you for a little bit. So I was just going to give you kind of a story of our bakery and business and how we became to build mills and what we've been doing in Vermont with our grain economy here. So I'll switch to PowerPoint here. And get that going. Go. Okay, that's it. Okay, so as we said, my wife and I were both chefs, and we worked in bakery in restaurants mostly. Didn't have too much interest in baking at the time, but a guy came into my wife's restaurant and said, "Hey, do you know anybody who might be interested in buying a small bakery, 10 acres of land and a house? We're looking to move on to something else, and we're the first people. You're the first people that we told about it." So my wife called me up and said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in being a baker?" And I said, "I hadn't really thought about it, but let's go check it out." So we went up to this people's house, and they had built their own Allen Scott oven and started to bake out of it, and we're selling bread to the community. And we thought, oh, this is kind of neat. We were looking for a change to kind of get out of the restaurant world but still have our hands in food and do something a little different. So we said, sure, let's give it a shot. So he said, all right, well, we have about 3 or 4 weeks before we close. So he taught us the basics. We had to learn how to bake, how to mix, how to fire the oven, how to do QuickBooks, how to do a lot of everything really quickly. But we persevered, and this is my wife Blair, kind of learning how to do some of our first bakes out of that wood-fired oven. It's a Allen Scott 5x7, and we began to bake 3 days a week, 2 or 3 different varieties of bread, and we were selling it to local restaurants and grocery stores and general stores and co-ops and stuff in our area. One of the challenges we had was just figuring out how to use this wood-fired oven and how to maximize what we could do with it. So there were several other wood-fired bakers in New England, but also kind of all over the US, and started to reach out to them, asking them how they fired the oven, what kind of breads they baked, what techniques did they use to make the most of it, and started to build on this sort of community of bakers. Bakers are naturally pretty open people and have seemed to be willing to share their information and help each other out. I think baking bread and sharing bread is all part of that. So one of the issues we had was this oven, because it was a do-it-yourself, started to have some physical issues. The structure of it was starting to sag, and one of the big pieces of the hearth actually started to drop out. So in talking to all of these bakers, I had a bunch of ideas about how I wanted to improve on the wood-fired oven, make it more ergonomic, more efficient, a bit, and increase our production. So I teamed up with a friend who built masonry heaters here in Vermont, and he had some oven building experience. And we came up with this design. So this was different in that it was a 3-door oven. It allowed us to use a mechanical loader so that we could load the bread in much more quickly and efficiently, and produce nice, consistent results with our bread. We got that kind of going for a while, and that community of bakers that we had connected with started to come and visit again and say, "Hey, this oven's really great. Do you think we could get one for ourselves?" And so my friend William, who built that oven, decided to build more of them, and he ended up building about 20 of them all over the United States. And one of those bakers that I was good friends with was Dave Bauer. And Dave Bauer was in North Carolina in near Asheville, and he had the same oven, and so we connected on how to use it, how to improve it, and how to make the most of it. But the one thing that he did differently was he used a small mill to start, and he milled most of his grain for his bakery, and he also worked with a lot of local farmers. And I was sort of looking for the next challenge and looking to always improve our bread and make things a little bit better. So I called him up and I said, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in milling. Can you tell me what kind of mill I should buy, how I should get started and get into it?" And he knew that since I had all this design experience with building that first oven, that I'd probably be interested in building a mill. So he said, "I don't know anybody in around who's using natural granite stones to build a horizontal stone mill." So he said, let me do something for you." And he milled up a bunch of the local stuff that he had, and he sent us a box of flowers. And for us, we had been using white roller milled organic flour, but had never really experienced the aromas that happened when we opened up this box of flowers. He sent us some heirloom corns, some Abruzzi rye, some I think it was turkey red wheat, and we thought, this is unlike anything we've ever experienced before. We want to do this. We want to move forward and work with this kind of flour to make the best bread that we could possibly make. We figured, well, we already make the most difficult kind of bread out of a wood-fired oven, so why don't we take the challenge of trying to make it more difficult and mill all of our own flour? So I spent a couple months doing research and found that I could order some pink granite stones from North Carolina, from a different mill company called Meadows Mills that's been making mills for over 130 years, I think. They cut me some horizontal 36-inch diameter stones from this pink granite. And I worked with a friend who was an engineer and a welder friend, and they helped me build our first mill. So this is the mill kind of back in the corner where I'm lifting and dumping in a bag of wheat berries. We also sourced a blower and a sifter from Meadows Mills so that we would be able to create flour similar to what we had been using. So with our breads, we were, as I said, buying white flour, and then we would get some stone ground whole wheat flour and add 5 or 10% of it into our recipes, depending on what we were making. But since at this point we had been baking for, I guess, about 9 years, we didn't want to do a total switch on our customers and switch to entirely whole grain or something completely different. So as I got the mill working and kind of figured it out, we gradually increased the amount of fresh flour we started adding. By using the sifter, we were able to create um, a flour that was similar to the white flour, but much more flavorful and aromatic. And in fact, our customers started to notice too. They would come up to us when we were delivering in the grocery stores, and they would say, "Hey, I've been buying your bread for years now, and there's something more. I just can't quite place what it is." And they said, it's more weedy, and we hadn't really tasted that before, and that was a compliment in a way because that's what we were looking to do to sort of represent um, all the flavor that was in flour, especially when it's fresh milled. Um, this is some of the bread that we started to make after we switched to using all of that fresh milled grain in there.
So, Andrew, a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Have you ever found any small pieces of granite in your flour? And
Nope, nope. I think the stones do polish over time, and so I think there's very small amounts of granite dust that gets mixed in with the flour, but never actually had a chunk that we've bitten into.
any other FM issues as far as from the grain stream? Do you clean the grain before you put it through your mill, or how do you manage that grain quality on the front end?
Yep. So the farmers that we work with have cleaners set up on their farm, and they're able to do a pretty decent job. The other thing is with using the sifter there, if we do have some chaff or some some pieces of weed seeds or something like that, using the sifted flour will sift off some of those chunks that will sometimes be in the grain.
Do you temper your wheat?
Um, nope. Initially, we did temper the wheat. We thought that would be necessary to get that sort of whiter flour, and experimented with it quite a bit, but found that most of the wheat that we work with in New England tends to be not a real, it will have a higher moisture content. It'll usually be around 13%, especially when we get it straight from the harvest that year. And that the having that sort of higher moistures wheat, it mills up just fine on our stone mill.
Do you only grind the wheat once, or do you grind it multiple times?
We do single pass stone milling. Yeah, so we wanted to be able to get the cleanest extraction we could get by running it through once without having to remill.
And then which aperture sieves in the sifter?
We set our sifters up with 80 mesh, or about 225 micron screen that we get our flour through. That's typically 80 to 85% extraction of the flour, and then middling's a bran after that.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. So what happened here was, this is about 2014 when we got the mill built and started to integrate that fresh flour into our breads. The challenge was that was a really hard year for buying organic flour and especially organic wheat. There were two major farmers at the time who were growing wheat. This guy, Jack Laser, who had a farm called Butterworks a little bit northwest of us. And Jack was one of the pioneers for organic grain growing in Vermont. He always used to say that he had a dairy farm, an organic dairy farm, and that he made yogurt, and he said that he made yogurt to support his grain habit. But I reached out to him and said, "Hey, we built this mill. We're looking to source some grain." And he said, "Oh, this is a bad year. I really don't have anything extra." in addition, Ben Gleason was another farmer who didn't have very much. Also, the price of wheat went up quite a bit that year, and so we were really challenged to make this transition. But we're able to source cleaned and specced wheat from Champlain Valley Mills, which is not too far from us, and we also sourced some from La Milanese, which is just over the border in Quebec. And that was a nice way to start because we were able to work with wheat that was very clean, and it was also we knew what we were getting. So trying to understand how to properly mill it, but then also how to use it and have it perform consistently for us was aided by having that sorted and clean seed. So as we kind of got through that 2014 and worked with the wheat from those mills, we met a young couple who had got a farm through the Vermont Land Trust. It was a small dairy farm, but it had riverbed soil that was really nice for growing grain. So they picked up a used combine and planted about 20 acres of Redeemer wheat. And Redeemer wheat was a variety that the University of Vermont Extension Service had been testing in their test plots and found that for the climate in Vermont, it seemed to be performing pretty well. It had good resistance to fusarium, which is one of the big problems we have in Vermont. And so this couple, the Rogers, we met at a farmer's market, and they said, "Hey, we've planted this wheat. We don't really have a mill. We don't know exactly what we're going to do with it, but we wanted to give it a shot." And we said, "Well, that's great for us because we've been looking for Vermont wheat, but we haven't, and we have a mill and a bakery to use it. But so this might be a good fit." So after harvest, they sent their samples down to the University of Vermont Extension, where they're able to test it. The numbers came out good for protein, and it was safe. It was low enough with fusarium that we didn't have to worry about that. And so we started to develop to mill it and work with them. There's a picture of after they had harvested it that first time, and Blair actually got to ride in the combine. And what we decided to do was to, instead of blending it in with all of the wheat that we were getting from those mills, we created its own bread, and we wanted to give it a distinct look. So this was our Vermont Redeemer, and that was the first bread we made that was 100% sourced from Vermont, just about 30 miles away from our bakery. And we were fortunate that it had a nice, an appropriate name. We felt we were naming it the Vermont Redeemer Loaf was giving a way of saying, we are redeeming a tradition of grain that's grown close to your place and milled close and baked right away. So after we had developed that one, we got word around to some other farmers in the area. We have an annual conference with the Northern Grain Growers Association, and they are associated with the University of Vermont to help encourage farmers to grow small grains in Vermont. This is Morningstar Farm. We met Seth Johnson. He's up in Glover and has a small organic farm. And he had been growing primarily dry beans and selling them to restaurants and grocery stores in the area. He also grows grow some other small grains where he was making feed and selling organic animal feed without any soy in it, and raises the Angus beef herd that he feeds with that, which also produces all the manure that he needs on the farm for fertility. He had started to grow wheat as part of his rotation and as part of that feed, and said, "Hey, we've got about 10 tons of this. I think it was Bowles wheat that he had grown, and the kernels were kind of small, and he was having trouble selling it and getting other bakers to use it. And we said, well, let's take it and see what we could do with it. And we milled it, and we were able to sift it and blend it in with some of the other grain we had, and make the most of it. And that's always been one of the important parts we felt about working with these farms, is that they're taking enough risk as it is just trying to grow it for us. And so we said, if you grow it and you get it tested and it tests safe, we can work with a wide range of specs and create whatever we need to create to work with it. So we used up the rest of his crop, and then the next year he was encouraged to plant even more wheat, and now has become one of our bigger suppliers. And I really like Seth's farm because I feel, as with a small organic farm, he's figured out how to have a diverse source of incomes. So not only does he have the wheat, but he also has the feed. He sells the beef from the cattle. He also sells hay, and he does the dry beans as well. Another farmer, Nitty Gritty Grain Company, is the largest wheat farmer in Vermont. They're doing over 100 acres. And what they figured out worked best for them was they would take their wheat and send it over to Champlain Valley Mills, which is a roller mill just across the Lake Champlain. And they'll take it and clean it, send some of it back as clean wheat berries, but then also mill a lot of it into a white roller milled flour. And they found that was a good way for them to add value to their product, and but also make it more accessible to some of the consumers in Vermont who are more familiar with using white flour. Most recently, we've started working with the Zhang family farm. They're just located northeast of us in Waterford, Vermont. And Sean Zhang there, his grandfather started the farm in the 50s as a dairy farm, and operated as a dairy farm for several decades. But in 2015, found that they just couldn't compete. Dairy farms all over Vermont were closing because the price for milk was so low that they really couldn't make a go of it. And a large part of the landscape in Vermont are dairy farms. So they closed in 2015, but stayed open and continued to raise replacement heifers for other dairy farms in the region. Their son Sean here in the picture, he moved back to the farm after going to college and was curious about growing small grains on the farm. There was a maltster in Vermont named Andrew Peterson, who was encouraging farmers to grow barley for malting for beer malt, and then also growing wheat in addition to that. So he's starting to take over his family farm and is doing quite well. This is a crop from this year's warthog wheat that he grew. This is the warthog as it was a little bit midsummer before harvest. And what we decided to do was, they are in the process of transitioning from conventional land over to organic. And although all of the wheat that we use in our bakery is certified organic, we wanted to encourage them to grow and transition to um, growing organically. So we agreed to buy 10 tons of wheat from them, and we have a small wood fired or a small pizza business, and we have been milling their flour and using it in our pizza dough, and it's been working pretty nice. They've also decided to um, increase what they're growing, and so we've started to mill their wheat into flour and give it back to them, and then they're selling it, and they've started NEK, Northeast Kingdom grains, and selling it to other bakers and co-ops and stuff around Vermont.
So Andrew, we've got a couple questions coming in.
Sure.
So you mentioned you sent off the initial wheat to the Extension Service, and they did some tests. So what test did you perform on the wheat?
So the Extension Service tests for moisture and protein and falling number, and then also does the mold test to make sure that the DON is less than 1 part per million. That's the basics that we start out with. And, we usually just make sure that it's safe and make sure it doesn't have a ridiculously low falling number, just so it's usable. And protein, we're able to work with a range. We can create different breads, or we've milled it and sold it to people who are interested in making cookies or something like that. And we figured, since the farmer is taking most of the risk, if they would grow it, then we would do what we could to make the most of it. And this pizza dough is an example of that.
So would these be winter wheat varieties, spring wheat varieties? What type of wheats are you growing in Vermont today?
Most farmers have been successful with winter. Found that the winter wheats come up a lot quicker in the spring and can outcompete the weeds. The Morning Star farm that's growing the bowls, that's a spring wheat, and in his rotation he's had success with the bowls.
So generally soft wheat varieties or hard wheat varieties, or a combination of both?
All hard wheat.
All hard wheat. So a question came in specifically, a couple of questions about your mill. I guess going back to the grain, what is the minimum falling number that you'll accept?
I gotta remember now what it is. I think the lowest stuff we've worked with was around 200, 220, something like that.
Okay. And you mentioned that your farmers generally clean the grain. You know what type of cleaning system are they? How are they cleaning that grain? Are they sending it in? Do they have cleaners on farm?
Cleaners on farm, yeah. It's to work at this scale is always challenging to find appropriately sized equipment, and so many of them have found really old stuff, old clipper cleaners and some spirals, and a couple of them have gravity tables that they've set up to clean on farm.
So you mentioned that your mill works on generally hard red winter is what you use it for. But does it work on all types of endosperm hardness? Any varieties or environments that produce grain that's too hard for your
mill? Nope. We use a full range of wheats. Generally, we don't get real high protein wheats here in Vermont. And they're typically not dry, like not real low moisture content. But we also mill spelt and rye, and we do some corn milling as well on the mills.
Have you or any of your customers ever milled sprouted hard red winter wheat?
I don't know that they have, but I've occasionally been asked about that. And I think as long as it was dried down well enough, it would be fine to mill it on the stone mill.
Very good. We've got a couple other questions, probably a little more directly related towards the mill, and we might save those for a little bit. So,
Yep, I'll kind of get into the mill that I have behind me here after that. So let's see, where was I? So this is some of the flour that we were milling up from the Zhang family farm, the NEK grains. It's some whole wheat that we milled for them. This is a little statement that we put on the back of all of our loaves of bread, our bread bags, to share why we choose to stone mill flour for our bakery and for our other farmers. The thing that we found most important with working with that Zhang farm is that, and encouraging them to transition to organic, but also to move their dairy farm over to some grain growing, is to present different options for Vermont farms. One of the challenges that we've seen in Vermont is that dairy farming's become it's been very hard to make money at it. And so offering something like small grains growing to provide a different source of income and kind of set up this small grain economy has been our goal with the bakery and working with these farms. And in Vermont, that's great because we're allowing those farmers to develop the land to keep a working agriculture landscape instead of those farms closing and going away and just having a lot of second homeowners buying up all of our beautiful land. So working with all those farmers, it's brought our bakery now to a point where we've accomplished our goal of completely sourcing our wheat from Vermont. This year, it's been 5 years of working with all these different farmers now. We're able to source 100% of our grain needs between 4 different farmers. And that's over 50 tons of organic wheat. And even though we're not that big of a bakery, I feel like it's sort of demonstrating a model how it is possible to work directly with farmers, source from them, and sort of develop this small regional grain economy. The nice thing is that it's keeping all of those dollars in Vermont, and we're paying the farmers directly a better price than what they would get from selling it to a bigger mill. And also it means that the Vermonters here are eating food that's grown right in Vermont. It's less miles that the grain has to travel before it gets to their house and to their plate. We've also found that working locally, it's created resiliency in our food system. When the pandemic hit, I'm sure many of you saw that there was no flour on the grocery store shelves. It was bought up pretty quickly, and so people started saying, "Hey, do you have any flour available?" And of course, we had tons and tons of it. So we started to mill it, get more from our farmers, and bag it and sell it to stores and to anybody who called us up asking for it. I felt pretty good about having that resiliency and being able to supply our community with flour as well as bread. So that kind of brings us back around to what happened with the stone mill business. Because we had the stone mill and we're able to do that, this community of bakers that we had built from learning the wood-fired oven and doing the mills, and we found that they came around and started saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing in Vermont? Can we come check out your mill? We'd be interested in learning more about what you're doing up there." And one friend said, "Hey, would you build one of those mills for me?" And he was a friend down in New Orleans from Bellegarde Bakery, and another friend from Vancouver Island in Victoria said, "Hey, would you build a mill for me?" And then one thing led to another, and I decided to start taking what I had learned from building our own mill and start building them for other people. So I was lucky that in Barrie, Vermont, which is about half an hour from our bakery, there's a beautiful quarry that has a really nice quality of granite. This is Barrie gray granite, and met the friend of the granite union representative, and he shopped it around and said, "Oh yeah, I can find somebody to cut millstones for you." So this is from Granite Importers. Nobody had cut millstones for use in Vermont for a couple hundred years. And so these are some of the first ones they made for us. And I ended up teaching myself how to cut the pattern into the stones again. And we came up with our first utilitarian functional mills. This was for my friend out in Vancouver Island. But eventually started to refine the design, clean them up a bit, used all stainless steel for the hoppers and the case of the mill, and came up with a more attractive functional design so that bakers who go through the extra effort to mill their own flour and source grain, that they can show off the mill as this sort of symbol of the extra effort that they're using to do this and produce bread with local grain. And that's really the goal of the Stone Mill Company as we've grown, is to continue to build this community of bakers that want to use fresh milled flour and to source it locally. In Vermont now, there are 7 different bakeries and farms that use our mills to produce flour for the for their bakeries, as well as milling it for other customers. And over the last year, I think a lot of people saw with the flour shortages that they saw an opportunity. And so a number of farms, probably a good, almost half of my customers have been farms. They're looking to mill on farm. And so these 4 mills here were 4 out of 6 that mill just up in Quebec called Moulin de Premel ordered. And they're setting up 6 of the mills along with more material handling, pneumatic systems and bigger sifters and loaders and stuff to create a more extensive on-farm milling system. Of course, milling on farm creates its own set of challenges. There's the additional time spent to do the milling, to package it, distribute it. But many of these farmers are finding that the increased value they get from selling the flour directly really can make it worth it. And the nice thing about the farm working with their crop is if they have a good crop, then they're milling the same thing throughout the year, and then they can have some consistency in what they're providing. And I've traveled, not so much recently, but over the years I've been traveling around, and a lot of times when people get these mills and they're not familiar with how to use it at all, I'll come and set it up and teach them how to use it and create flour. So I'll switch off of this. There we go. Did you have some more questions there, Mark?
Yep. So you mentioned farmers buying these mills, and the question came in, do you have recommendations on how to talk to nervous insurance agents or attorneys about the explosion hazard? Somebody mentioned that they have a farmer that wants to put one in a barn on their farm, and they're running into problems from liability standpoint.
That's a challenging question. Generally, the size of these mills and the amount of flour that they produce doesn't put you in a real high risk category for flour explosions. Our basic mills, the way they're set up is without pneumatic systems, and the size of them, the pneumatic system is often where you have a lot of issues with explosion risk.
Very good. When you start up the mill, How does it start up? Is it run without grain to warm the stones? Does the mill product change with run times? And what's the typical feed rate? Believe it or not, that's all one. That it's a bit of a run-on question. We can ask them one at a time. But if you want to walk us through kind of the startup and how do you start that up?
Sure. Yeah, let me just switch over here. I'll kind of show you the mill and how it works. So you see that okay?
Yep.
So the mills are all set up with variable frequency drives, so they soft start, so they go from 0 to full speed over 10 seconds. We usually just start them from cold, room temperature. Of course, the more you mill and the longer you mill, because those stones are rubbing against each other, they're going to create friction and heat. So you're limited somewhat to how long you can mill by that. If you're starting at room temperature, it's 70 degrees or so. You can mill for hours and hours before you get to a point. Usually we say like 120, 125 degrees is the high end of where we like to see the mills run. Mostly that's just because when you get at those temperatures, we find that if the stone is that hot and the flour is coming that hot, the moisture in that flour tends to stick to the stone, and you can paste them over, and then you have to take the mill apart and clean the stones off. Yeah. So they're very simple to operate. You really only have 2 controls that you have to consider. There's motor speed for one, but generally they're set so they just run at the full speed. This is a 26-inch model, and it spins at about 280 RPM. There's the auger feed, so how fast the grain is fed into the stones. And then there's the stone gap. This is just a hand wheel with a dial on it that tells you how far apart the stones are relative to each other. The nice thing about having the auger feed is you can set that rate and feed it in at a real consistent bounce per hour. I'll take the top off real quick and I can show you the stones and explain a little bit how stone milling works, because a lot of people don't really understand what's going on inside the machine. So there weren't very many resources for figuring out how these stone mills worked, and there really aren't too many books out there. But there's an organization called the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills, SPOO.org, and they've reprinted a number of these really old milling books. One of them that was this practical milling. This is from the early 1900s. And then this other really old one, Oliver Evans, The Young Millwright. And so they have all of these old drawings of old mill systems and mill stones. And I read through those quite a bit to try to understand how these worked, but also so I don't know how well you can see it here.
Yep, we can see it.
So you can see the runner stone, and then we have the bed stone. Those are cut with a pattern with furrows, which are the grooves, and then the lands, which are the flat part. And if you look at these 2 stones side by side, they'd have the exact same the exact same pattern on them. What happens as the stones go against each other, this is a model of what's happening. So those, this is the top stone spinning, and if you can see it spinning across, those furrows scissor like that, and so they break the grain down into smaller and smaller particles. The furrows do the breaking action, and the lands are doing the grinding. So you can see this is a cross section of what you're looking at, and they actually spin this way. So as the grain drops into the depth of the furrow there, it's the pinching right here as those two come together that does the milling.
So the bottom stone is stationary, the top one spins.
Yes, that's correct. And kind of reading about all of these stone dresses. So they call it the pattern they call a stone dress. And one of the things I looked at was every miller had their own way of cutting the stone, and they all believed they had a little trick that would either make the mills run cooler, or higher pounds per hour, or create whiter flour. And so they patented all of their drawings, and you can Google millstone patents. And I sorted through all kinds of them, trying to figure out what every little tweak was and how they were looking to kind of improve on the technology of it, the way it works. It's funny, it's called the dress. The people will refer to, the old books will refer to the eye as the center of the stone, but then this region they call the bosom, and then the waist and the skirt. So they use these as terms of the dress of the stone.
And occasionally you have to dress those after use. You have to dress these stones again, correct?
Yeah. So it depends on how much they're milling, how hard the grain is. The stones will polish over the course of use, and so in order to keep them running optimally, the stones have to be redressed. Usually I travel to bakeries and teach the bakers or farmers how to redress the stones. So this is a pneumatic stone tool that was actually invented here in Vermont, right next to that quarry by Trow and Holden, and it's a kind of like a little meat hammer, and we use that to chip the surface of the stone because it'll polish to like a 200 grit sandpaper, and you want it more like a 40 grit sandpaper to be milling optimally. It also involves some re-channeling of the furrows and making sure they have the right shape.
So, and the question came in, how often do you need to redress? And you said that really comes down to the type of wheat or the type of grain that you're grinding, correct?
Yeah, how hard it is and how much you're using it.
So if you're primarily running a hard red winter wheat for your mill, how often, just on average, would you say you're redressing your stones?
We usually do it once a year. That seems to work fine for us.
Okay.
The other thing we found is that if somebody's looking to create whole wheat flour that has much finer bran particles, the sharper you keep the lands of the stone, the more it tends to grind that bran up more, and so you get a finer, more consistent textured whole grain flour. So some of the bakeries that are only milling whole grain flour like to redress more often.
So your pneumatic stone tool, you said, so if somebody has a stone mill and they would like to get one of those, you sell them yourself, but is there other places you can find them as well?
Yeah, the company's called Trow, Trow, and Holden, Holden. And there's only a few stone tool, sculpting tool manufacturers in the world, and they're one of the best ones in the world.
Do you adjust the gap between the stones for each type of grain, and how difficult is it to adjust that gap?
Yeah, so depending on how hard the grain is and also if it's a softer grain like rye or spelt, it doesn't require as much stone pressure, just because it's much easier for the stones to crush the grain. And for our mills, we put a little scale on the hand wheel there so that you can calibrate it so that you know how close the stones are running together.
And you mentioned on startup, it's run variable, right? So it will slower at the start and it'll automatically increase in speed. Can you walk us through that startup process again?
Yeah, so the pulley's calibrated to run at 280 RPM full speed. So once you turn it on, it just slowly accelerates, just to be easier on the motors and the bearings.
And what is a typical feed rate?
So for this smaller mill, we usually say 50 to 75 pounds per hour is what we recommend. And if it's harder, we'll run it at a slower feed rate. If it's softer, you can mill faster.
Question came in, do you recommend two-stage grinding?
Usually not. We originally designed these for bakeries, and so bakeries have a whole number of things that they have to keep track of, and so we wanted it to be as simple and consistent as we could provide for them. And so we figured if we could size everything so that you could load in 100 pounds of grain and have a 100-pound bin for the flour to come into, then you could just set it and do it. You could set a timer and come back an hour or so later and empty it. And that way they didn't have to mess around with trying to run it through multiple times.
Sounds good. Could the pneumatic stone tool company, could you what was the name of that company again?
Trow, TROW, and Holden, HOLDEN.
Very good. So we've about run out of time. Anything else additional you'd like to share with us? This is very interesting. Thank you very much for the information, but anything additional?
No, I think that's the gist of it. I've been really happy to share my story of how what we've done here in Vermont and with the stone mills, spreading them all over the world. And hopefully more of these grain economies smaller grain economies will grow.
One last question that came in. If you place an order, how long does it take to get a delivery?
It's about 3 months.
3 months? Very good. That's a good question to ask. So, well, very good. Well, thanks to all of our participants for taking the time this morning and for the great questions. And Andrew, thank you very much for your time and sharing your knowledge. And speaking from experience, I just gave a tour of our facility this morning. It's a beautiful mill.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Bye-bye.